Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to my video on July's chapters of Charles Dickens's Bleak House. So if you don't know, I'm currently hosting a Victorian-style serialised read-along of this book where we read it a few chapters a month as the Victorians would have originally read it. So in the month of July we read chapters 14, Deportment, 15, Bell Yard, and 16, Tom All Alones. Firstly, before I get into discussing these chapters, I'm sorry that this video on July's chapters is quite late. Because July was Jane Austen July, I got a bit distracted and didn't read Bleak House's July chapters in July, and therefore read them in August, but like halfway through August, so I'm sorry about that. But here we are, and hopefully August's video will be slightly less late, so there we go. But yes, let's speak about these great three chapters. As usual, I will talk about each chapter in turn, first quickly talking about the plot, and then talking about things of significance and interest in these chapters. So, chapter 14, Deportment. Here we are once again in Esther's narrative, her first person voice, and Richard has just left the household to make his way in the world, and Esther and Ada and Mr. Jarndyce remain in London a little bit longer. The household receive a call from Caddy Jellyby, who Esther had met previously, and Caddy tells Esther that she is really trying to improve herself, that she went to go and get deportment and dancing lessons, and that there she met a young man called Prince Turvy Job, and now they are engaged to be married. Only Dickens would create a character called Prince Turvy Job. I said the word out loud, fairly confident that that was his name, and had to just like check in the text to make sure that that was definitely his name, because it sounded too silly to be his name, but it is his name because Dickens is glorious. So Caddy tells Esther that she is engaged, and she takes Esther along to the dance school to meet her fiancé and also her fiancé's ridiculous father, who just sits around looking elegant while his son does all the work. I'll talk about them a bit more in a second. After Esther has watched Caddy at her dancing lesson, Caddy and Esther head on to visit Miss Flight, the little old lady we have met before who lodges with Mr. Crook. Mr. Jarndyce and Ada are already there, and they meet Miss Flight again, see how she is getting on, and finally learn the names of her birds, who all have quite depressing names. And then we also meet the medical man who's looking after Miss Flight, who is one Mr. Woodcourt, who was also the man who found the body of Nemo in the previous chapters, and is also the man that Esther forgot to mention until the last minute was at the dinner with Mr. Bayham Badger, and he also comes for dinner here, which Esther also forgets to mention until the end, and we get the impression of her potential interest in him. So, points of interest in this chapter. I'm not going to talk too much about Richard in this chapter. He's only in the first few pages of this chapter, but I do think it's worth dwelling for a moment on this kind of repetition of Richard's interest in the suit and his constant hope and underlying hope that something might come of it which will make them rich, and how, although he says that he knows it might not happen and he's gonna go and work for it, we also get the impression that this is a constant weight on his mind and something that he thinks about a lot and that he dreams about. And if the rich suit should make us rich, Esther, which it may, you know, a shade crossed Ada's face. My dearest Ada, asked Richard, pausing. Why not? It had better declare us poor at once, said Ada. Oh, I don't know about that, returned Richard, but at all events it won't declare us anything. It hasn't declared anything in heaven knows how many years. Too true, said Ada. Yes, but, urged Richard, answering what her look suggested rather than her words, the longer it goes on, dear cousin, the nearer it must be to a settlement one way or another. Now, is that not reasonable? And we see how, although he claims to not pin his hopes on the suit, he also kind of does a bit, which is a kind of recurring theme throughout the book and something to always look out for. I've talked quite a lot about Mrs. Jellyby already in previous videos, so I won't dwell again too much on her hair, though I will talk about her a bit in comparison to Mr. Turvy Job, because I think that's quite interesting in a moment. But it is worth noting again how when we see Caddy, when she appears to Ada and Esther, she also still kind of looks a sight. She is tired. Pee-Pee, her little brother, just looks slightly chaotic because Caddy has tried to improve him in a way that didn't quite work, and he looks neglected effectively. You know, his knees are covered in scratches and his clothes have been attempted to be mended by Caddy, but really poorly. Caddy also says that she's tired, she's been working for her mother up till 2 in the morning and really hates it, but Esther also thinks that she is improved, that she looks prettier, that she looks better, and we see that she is happier and that she feels happier in herself because she has gone to this school which makes her feel sort of more ladylike, and also because she has met this young man that she is going to marry, even though she has not told any of her family this yet, nor his. And again we get the same kind of criticism, not of charity in itself, but of the way in which Mrs. Jellyby does charity and the way in which she does it to the neglect of everyone around her. and in complete sort of carelessness of her children's kind of health and mental well-being. Caddy at one point says that it won't bother her mother if she leaves home to get married because I am only pen and ink to her. Caddy feels that her mother doesn't even sort of view her as a real person, she's just kind of a mechanism and a tool for her charity work. I've spoken before about the different ways you can approach Mrs. Jellyby as a character. Sometimes I find her depiction very infuriating because part of the fault Dickens finds with her is that she is a woman and that she works and she doesn't look after her household very well, and that this, as a sort of woman, is her responsibility. But also there are a lot of other criticism levelled at Jellyby. The criticism that she is very careless and sort of cruel to her children is, you know, a fair one, and also there is, I think, a sort of anti-colonialist criticism of her in terms of her doing all this work for Africa while not really caring about the people there. There's a lot of talk of the fact that Mrs. Jellyby's charity work is involved in the cultivation of coffee conjointly with natives, whether she is trying to genuinely improve the lives of people living in Africa, or whether she is involved in sort of sending out missions to convert them to Christianity, or whether her charitable work is actually all about kind of cultivating coffee there in order to sell it and sort of make money. It's never quite clear, but I do think there are some criticisms levelled at Mrs. Jellyby by Dickens on that account as well. But I have spoken about Mrs. Jellyby before and will again, so I won't go into too much depth here, but I do want to talk about the Turvy Jobs because they are a really, really interesting pair. I love one of the things that Caddy says about the man she is to marry. Young Mr. Turvy Job's name is Prince. I wish it wasn't because it sounds like a dog, but of course he didn't christen himself. Oh, Dickens. Just makes me laugh so very much. Now, the Turvy Jops are a really, really interesting pair, and I want to talk about Mr. Turvy Jop in some length and kind of talk about him as a kind of male equivalent of Mrs. Jellyby, because I think this is quite an interesting thing to look at in terms of Dickens's depiction of gender and of kind of separate spheres of gender within this book. Let us dwell a bit upon the depiction of young Mr. Turvy Jop and old Mr. Turvy Jop. Here is our first impression of Prince. I curtsied to a little blue-eyed fair man of youthful appearance, with flaxen hair parted in the middle and curling at the ends all round his head. He had an innocent, feminine manner, which not only appealed to me in an amiable way, but made this singular effect upon me, that I received the impression that he was like his mother, and that his mother had not been much considered or well used. And here is what we learn about Mr. Turvy Jop Senior. He was a fat old gentleman with a false complexion, false teeth, false whiskers and a wig. And later, he had a cane, he had an eyeglass, he had a snuff box, he had rings, he had wristbands, he had everything but any touch of nature. He was not like youth, he was not like age, he was like nothing in the world but a model of deportment. And later Esther tells us that Prince does everything, including playing the music and teaching the dancing and humming the tune and setting everyone right in the room, while his distinguished father did nothing whatever but stand before the fire, a model of deportment. Esther speaks to an old lady who is watching the dancers, among whom are her nieces, who tells her a bit more about the history of this man and his relationship with his wife. And Esther tells us that he had married a meek little dancing mistress with a tolerable complexion, and had worked her to death, or had, at the best, suffered her to work herself to death to maintain him in those expenses which were indispensable to his position. Interesting, of course, that the most kind of damning expressions of dislike of Mr. Turvy Jop are said by the old lady, who is a passerby and onlooker never named, who effectively acts as Dickens's mouthpiece within this, because Esther is too kind and meek a person herself to say some of the things that the old lady says, such as, oh, I could bite him. Dickens puts into the mouth of this old lady the kind of things that his usual kind of third-person omniscient narrator could say, but that Esther would not. I think there are a few things that are very interesting here. One is Mr. Turvy Jop and his kind of deportment, and how Esther describes everything as being so false. And we see this kind of critique levelled at sort of upper-class culture throughout Dickens. You know, for example, in his novel Our Mutual Friend, there is a lot about the kind of pretense and fakeness of the upper classes, how everything is a performance. Mr. Turvy Jop doesn't really seem quite upper class. He may be a model of deportment, he may look upper class, but his son runs a dancing school in a building that is a bit dingy and a little bit shabby. He may dress to perfection, but he is not a very wealthy man. But in adopting the kind of dress and deportment and culture and eloquence of the upper classes, he also adopts that sort of fakeness. This is not his true self, everything is a performance. Now I think it's very interesting if you look at what we are told about Mr. Turvy Jop's family life and his background with his wife, who is now dead. You can see a kind of similarity between Mrs. Jellyby and Mr. Turvy Jop, and I think Dickens does kind of set them up as gendered opposites in many ways. Mrs. Jellyby is presented throughout Bleak House as this woman who has kind of failed in her womanly duty, shall we say. I think it is more complicated. Like in general, Dickens's gender roles are a little bit more complicated than this, but to break it down a lot, Mrs. Jellyby is a woman who has kind of failed in the Victorian idea of what a woman's duty is because she entirely neglects her family. What she wants to do is work. It happens that she works in charity because that is one of the only spheres in which a woman can excel in the 19th century, but what she wants to do is work and do something kind of intellectually stimulating for herself, and thereby neglects her family and is kind of critiqued for it. But I think it's interesting to see Mr. Turvy Job as kind of a male version of Mrs. Jellyby, who has done the opposite. He is a man who has let down his family and his children by not working, by making his wife do all the work, while he stood around and dressed himself and made himself look pretty and attractive and impressive and kind of focused on almost accomplishments in the way that young ladies were encouraged to do in the 19th century. So I think you can see in Mr. Turvy Job and Mrs. Jellyby critiques which are in many ways very, very gendered. I find Dickens and gender something incredibly interesting because sometimes he is very forward-thinking and some of his female characters are really, really strong and interesting and really, really intelligent and assertive and fierce. But also there is a strong critique in Dickens, and especially in Bleak House, of certain unconventional gender roles, especially within marriage. And I do find that really, really interesting in terms of the way the Victorians thought about gender and in terms of looking at where Dickens is more forward-thinking and where he is more either backward-thinking or sort of thinking with the age, depending on how you want to look at it. And of course, Dickens's critique of Mrs. Jellyby and Mr. Turvy Job is not simply that they have got their gender roles wrong, it's also that they are incredibly careless of their children, and that is a critique on both accounts, both the father and the mother. Both Mrs. Jellyby and Mr. Turvy Job are criticised for not caring about their children's welfare and for making their children work really, really hard at things that are not always solely their children's responsibilities. So obviously there is a critique of their kind of what Dickens views as incorrect gender roles, but there's also a great critique of their sort of bad parenting skills as well. And moving on a little bit from talking about sort of gender roles within marriage, I want to talk a little bit about Caddy and her talking about her upcoming marriage. She tells Esther that she is trying to kind of learn domesticity, learning to be a better sort of housekeeper so that she can marry Prince and be a housewife. She talks about going to see Miss Flight and kind of tidying her house and making her coffee and trying to be better at sort of keeping people comfortable so that she can do the same for Prince. This of course is very conventional Victorian gender roles. Then she also says that kind of Prince can barely write, he can't spell anything, but that she is very, very good at writing, so it's okay because when they're married she can kind of do any writing that's required for both of them, which is slightly less conventional. So I think that's interesting too, to note how Dickens has his moments of real kind of very strict Victorian gender roles and then also moments where he breaks it as well. So yes, Caddy wants to learn how to be more domestic for her husband's comfort, but she is also the much more educated and learned of the two of them, and she also plans to use that to help their relationship and their success and their lives together as well. Let's talk a little bit about the visit to Miss Flight as well. I think it's interesting how on the way up the stairs Caddy points out to Esther the place where Mr. Nemo died, and we kind of get those subtle links between Esther's narrative and the other narrative in the book. It reminded Caddy to tell me as we proceeded up the stairs that there had been a sudden death there and an inquest, and that her little friend had been ill of the fright. A sad and desolate place it was, a gloomy, sorrowful place that gave me a strange sensation of mournfulness and even dread. "You look pale," said Caddy when we came out, "and cold." I felt as if the room had chilled me. We get another kind of sense of dread and bad omens, I suppose, in a way, when Crook tells the characters the names of Miss Flight's birds, which she has said she wouldn't want to tell them previously. Quite a strange and bizarre list of names. Hope, joy, youth, peace, rest, life, dust, ashes, waste, want, ruin, despair, madness, death, cunning, folly, words, wigs, rags, sheepskin, plunder, precedent, jargon, gammon, and spinach. I think the order that he gives the names in is interesting, and I wonder if the order is the order in which she named them, if the first birds of her collection were called Hope, Joy, and Youth, and then descended kind of into misery and then finally into almost madness. She is described quite often as mad, and the last names of her birds are just really, really weird, like gammon and spinach. Before we move on to the next chapter, let's quickly talk about Mr. Woodcourt and Esther's attempts to keep him out of the narrative. It's interesting though, I think, because Esther's kind of narrative unreliability, this technique which is used here for the second time of not really mentioning Mr. Woodcourt and his importance until the very end of the chapter, actually doesn't really leave him out but brings much more attention to him, which I find quite interesting. Almost as though someone is looking over the page as she's writing and reminding her that she's got it wrong, or she's reminding herself that she's been a little bit inaccurate. Of course, we know much more about her impression of Mr. Woodcourt from what she doesn't say than what she does. She says very little, and that in itself is incredibly telling, because she's very happy to chatter on about everybody else. I have forgotten to mention, at least I have not yet mentioned, that Mr. Woodcourt was the same dark young surgeon whom he had met at Mr. Badger's, or that Mr. Jarndyce invited him to dinner that day, or that he came, or that when they were all gone I said to Ada, "Now, my darling, let us have a little talk about Richard." Ada laughed and said, but I don't think it matters what my darling said. She was always merry. And now let's move on to chapter 15, Bell Yard. This is another chapter of Esther's narrative, and we are still in London, and we begin the chapter with a little bit of a description about Mr. Jarndyce and his involvement in charity work, and how so many people come to him in order to get his help, and how he is not quite sure if he approves of the way that all of them go about it. And then Mrs. Skimpole comes to see them in the London house and says that the man who had arrested him for debt several weeks before has just died, and Mrs. Skimpole is kind of pleased about this, and Mr. Jarndyce is very sorry to hear that the man has left behind him 3 children in a very impoverished state. So Mr. Jarndyce says, well, let's go and see them, which they do. They go to a place called Bell Yard to find these 3 children, the Neckett children. And they also meet the downstairs neighbour, Mr. Gridley, and then they meet the 3 children. Charlie, the eldest, who is about 13 or 14, and the 2 younger ones, a boy of 5 called Tom, and Emma, who is just a baby. And Charlie says that she is working as a washerwoman in order to look after them, and that she has to wear patterned shoes, so shoes with sort of platforms effectively, in order to reach the tubs because she is so little. Mr. Jarndyce has quite a long conversation with Gridley in which we find out that he too, like so many of the characters in this book, is a kind of victim of the Chancery Court, whose unsolved case has caused sort of complete chaos of his life and sort of driven him into a really miserable and very, very angry state. And then as they leave, Mr. Jarndyce asks the landlady sort of what's been done for these children, how they get on, how sustainable it is, and we get the impression that he is thinking of some way in order to try and help them. So, points of interest in this chapter. I want to talk quickly a little bit about the presentation of charity. I don't think I'd really realised until making this read-along series just how much an important theme charity is within Bleak House. I think it's possibly almost as important a theme as the law. Like, I feel like I'm talking about it every single video. So because I have been talking about it in nearly every single video, I won't dwell upon it too much here, but I do think it's interesting again to look at the comparison between Mr. Jarndyce as this kind of figure of quiet charity who, as we learn in the last chapter, is paying money to Miss Flight without telling her who it is and without ever having any intention of revealing who it is, and the very, very kind of loud, bustling charity of people like Mrs. Jellyby and Mrs. Pardigle, who Mr. Jarndyce helps but is also not sure about their methods. And the impression we certainly get of characters like Mr. Quayle and Mrs. Pardigle and Mrs. Jellyby and Mr. Gusher is that their reason for kind of doing charitable works is to look good and to patronise people and sort of feel power over people who have less in life than them, rather than to actually help those people. It's just to kind of moralise. In short, we heard of a great many missions of various sorts among this set of people, but nothing respecting them was half so clear to us as that it was Mr. Quayle's mission to be in ecstasies with everybody else's mission, and that it was the most popular mission of all. All this kind of charity doesn't come from good feeling like Mr. Jarndyce's does. Really, it's all fake. It's a pretense. They're pretending to care about people who have less in life than them because they want to look good rather than because they really care about these people. I want to talk a little bit about Mr. Skimpole and his childlike nature. I don't like Mr. Skimpole, as I've said before. I think he is a very, very well-created character, and Dickens really pushes Skimpole's sort of childish nature to such a point that you almost can't believe it. He comes across as a bit of a hypocrite too. He clearly doesn't like Mr. Boythorn, but if he's invited to stay with Mr. Boythorn and will get lots of free meals out of it, he's very willing to go. In many ways, the way he most comes across like a child is that his kind of emotions and sort of sense of serious situations isn't quite right. He's kind of casually playing the piano while telling them that this man who once arrested him is dead and has left 3 very poor children behind, and how he's kind of slightly satisfied that this man has died. And then later, after they've met these children, he feels kind of smug and proud of himself that in being in debt he created work for this man and therefore feels that he has done something for these children. I want to talk, of course, about the Neckett children, these 3 siblings that we see. I feel like one of the saddest parts of the whole of Bleak House, though there are a lot of very sad parts, is Esther going up to this door and the children shouting that they're locked in because this 5-year-old and 1-year-old are locked in for their own safety because no one can look after them, and their 13-year-old sister, who is the only person who is there to look after them, has to go out working and can't take care of them and locks them in for their safety. It was very common in the Victorian period. A lot of mothers who went out to work used to lock their children in during the day so that they couldn't like run away and get into danger. But also the very image of these children sort of being trapped in this room and they can't get out because there's no one to check that they wouldn't harm themselves. I find that like really, really sad. I think too their kind of cheerful optimism in many ways and their desire to show these visitors they have that they're okay, that they're doing all right and they're going to be fine. Like, I find that really, really sad as well. That's almost worse than if they were miserable. "God help you, Charlie," said my guardian. "You're not tall enough to reach the tub." "In patterns I am, sir," she said quickly. "I've got a high pair as belonged to my mother." "And you always lock the babies up when you go out?" "To keep 'em safe, sir, don't you see," said Charlie. "Mrs. Blinder comes up now and then, and Mr. Gridley comes up sometimes, and perhaps I can run in sometimes and they can play, you know. And Tom ain't afraid of being locked up, are you, Tom?" "No," said Tom stoutly. "When it comes on dark, the lamps are lighted down the court and they show up here quite bright, almost quite bright, don't they, Tom?" "Yes, Charlie," said Tom, "almost quite bright." The mix of strength and fear in these orphans is really powerful and sort of really well done, I think, by Dickens. Before I move on to the next chapter, I wanted to quickly talk about Mr. Gridley. I think he's an interesting figure to consider alongside, one, Miss Flight, and also alongside Tom Jarndyce, who we've heard about before, the man who killed himself in Mr. Crook's shop. These three people are three people we've shown who have been driven to very, very different kind of extremes by cases gone wrong in Chancery. All three of them act as kind of warnings to the younger wards in Jarndyce, to Ada and Richard. Miss Flight has been driven to at least eccentricity and sort of being a social outcast, if not potentially madness, by her suit. Mr. Gridley has sort of lost all his livelihood and the life he would have had and has become this kind of really angry, miserable, rude person, violent, who has been imprisoned for kind of contempt of court. We see his rudeness and what he tells us of his arrest in comparison to the gentleness with which he treats those three children. We see how his character has kind of been disrupted and corrupted by the Court of Chancery, and with Tom Jarndyce we've already seen how the suit drove him to kill himself in Mr. Crook's shop. Again and again we get these kind of bad omens and warning signs. Next I want to talk about chapter 16, Tom All-Alone's. Here we are back to Charles Dickens's third-person omniscient narrator, and we start off with my Lady Dedlock moving between London and her house in the country, while Celesta Dedlock sits at home slightly ill with gout, and she travels around without him. And then we move suddenly to Joe, the crossing sweeper boy who we've met before, whom Mr. Nemo was so kind to, and he is visited by a strange cloaked lady who walks like a lady but dresses like a servant and tells him that she is a servant but also has very nice rings and white hands for a servant. And this woman asks Joe to show her the places where Mr. Nemo lived and got his work and was finally buried. And after he has done that, she gives him a lot of money and leaves. And then after that, we're informed that up in Chesney Wold, Mrs. Rouncewell hears the steps on the Ghost Walk much louder than ever before. Right, let's talk about points of interest in this chapter. There's not too much I can talk about here because of kind of spoilery mystery stuff. This is one of those chapters that is very much in the kind of more mystery elements of the plot, so it's slightly harder to discuss them than Esther's narrative, which is a little bit more sort of tied up in sort of social critique, although there is plenty of social criticism in this chapter as well. So, first let's quickly talk about Celesta Dedlock and his gout, because I quite like Celesta Dedlock. He's a very interesting character for one of the characters who in some ways should be dislikable, but I also am quite fond of. For all his like upper class pride, and his pride like even in gout because it's a fairly aristocratic disease, he also really cares about his wife and is sad to have gout because he can't go around with her. But now let's move on to Joe, because as I promised there's plenty of social criticism in this chapter as well. Let us look at the description of the awful place where Joe lives. Joe lives, that is to say, Joe has not yet died, in a ruinous place known to the like of him by the name of Tom All-Alone's. These tumbling tenements contain by night a swarm of misery. It is a black, dilapidated street, avoided by all decent people, where the crazy houses were seized upon when their decay was far advanced by some bold vagrants who, after establishing their own possession, took to letting them out in lodgings. Now these tumbling tenements contain by night a swarm of misery. As on the ruined human wretch vermin parasites appear, so these ruined shelters have bred a crowd of foul existence that crawls in and out of the gaps in walls and boards and calls itself up to sleep in maggot numbers, where the rain drips in, wind and comes and goes, fetching and carrying fever, and sowing more evil in every footprint, the Lord Coodle or Sir Thomas Doodle or the Duke of Foodle, and all the fine gentlemen's in office down to Zoodle, shall ever set right in 500 years, though born expressly to do it. Twice lately there has been a crash and a cloud of dust like the springing of a mine in Tom All-Alone's, and each time a house has fallen. This desirable property is in chancery, of course. It would be an insult to the discernment of any man with half an eye to tell him so. So this is both a sort of social critique of the awful conditions in which many of the sort of very, very poor of London live, and also it's again a critique of chancery, because the reason why these houses are in disrepair and in a state of non-ownership is because they are in chancery. And Dickens talks about how excluded Joe is from the rest of the world, especially from the kind of middle and upper class world. Joe's sort of catchphrase throughout the book is, "I don't know nothing." He has not been allowed to know anything. The position he is in society at the kind of the very, very bottom means he is not kind of allowed any knowledge. He has had no learning. He knows nothing but how to sweep a street. And another thing that is incredibly criticised, which was criticised earlier on in the book as well, is the place where Mr. Nemo is buried. They come to the little tunnel of a court and to the gas lamp, lighted now, and to the iron gate. "He was put there," says Joe, holding to the bars and looking in. "Where? Oh, what a scene of horror." "There," says Joe, pointing. "Over yonder, among them pile of bones, and close to the kitchen window. They put him very nigh the top. They was obliged to stamp on it to get it in. I could uncover it for you with my broom if the gate was open. That's why they locks it, I suppose," giving it a shake. "It's always locked. Look at the rat," cries Joe, excited. "Hi, look, there he goes, ho, into the ground." And there are 2 points of interest here, I think. One, the sort of awfulness of this terrible place where Mr. Nemo is buried, where you can literally see the bones of other people who've been buried because they haven't been buried properly. Like, it's just awful. And also the fact that for Joe, that's normal. He's casual about it. That's how people in his situation in life is buried. And when the woman asks if this ground is consecrated, if it's blessed, he doesn't have any idea what she means, because that is so much a world apart from him. So I think that's all I wanted to say about that chapter and about the 3 chapters I've spoken about today. 3 really interesting chapters, I think. I'm just loving rereading Bleak House and thinking about this book in much more depth than I have for a while, and lots of different things too. I think because I have studied Bleak House, but the most recent time when I studied it was for my dissertation, and I pretty much entirely looked at only gender in Bleak House. And it's really interesting for me to look at kind of class and other issues or social criticism and the kind of position of the characters and the structure of it and the way the dual narrative works, and lots of things that I kind of haven't thought about for a while, because the last time I read it I was pretty much only thinking about gender. So in the month of August, which is already well underway, we will be reading the next 3 chapters. Chapter 17, Esther's Narrative, Chapter 18, Lady Deadlock, and Chapter 19, Moving On. I'm very excited to talk to you about the next few chapters as well. Thank you very much for watching today. Please let me know if you read the last few chapters of Bleak House and how you enjoyed it, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.